think we can all agree that being attacked by a bear ranks high on the worst possible fate someone can suffer. This was especially true before modern medicine, but this story is even worse than that. This is the infamous story of a man who was brutally mauled by a bear in the remote wilderness and then left for dead by his companions. As a warning, although the events in this video are fleeting and non-descriptive, they are still highly disturbing, so viewer discretion is advised. The story of Hugh Glass is going to be a unique one compared to the other stories featured on the channel, which are typically tirelessly researched for accuracy and compiled through a variety of sources. Before we even begin the story of Hugh's life, and in the interest of full transparency, we have to establish that much of it is unverified and the accounts about him lie somewhere on the spectrum between fact and fiction. Much of what is known about Hugh has been passed down through word of mouth, which is obviously prone to exaggerations and incorrect retellings. In addition, because it's been featured so heavily in popular culture in recent decades, it's close to impossible to separate the authentic from the inauthentic anymore. It's probably most well known as the inspiration behind the award-winning movie The Revenant from 2015, in which Hugh was played by Leonardo DiCaprio. Much of the plot is similar to Hugh's story, but many of the details in the movie are unverified, uncertain, or outright false. So to tell this story, I'll speak in certainties, but take everything with a grain of salt. Where appropriate, I'll also present the different variations of certain events to present a full picture of the lore behind the man and the man behind the lore. So with all of that said, Hugh was probably born in Scranton, Pennsylvania around 1783 to Irish parents, and next to nothing is known about his childhood, upbringing, or early adulthood. The legend begins in the early 30s when some sources say he abandoned a wife and 2 sons to start a new life as a sea captain off the coast of Texas. In 1816, his ship was attacked by pirates captained by the infamous buccaneer Jean Lafitte, and afterward, Hugh and the crewmen he employed were offered 2 choices: either join them and become pirates or suffer an agonizing death. The choice required very little consideration, and Hugh then spent up to 2 years robbing, pillaging, plundering, and killing for Lafitte until he escaped in 1818. Afterward, along with a companion, Hugh successfully traversed from Galveston Island through the shallows of the Gulf of Mexico and on to mainland Texas, but they weren't out of trouble just yet. Hugh and his companion then headed north, and as they did, they trekked through territory belonging to some of the more hostile Native American tribes. The Karankawa, for example, which occupied much of the Texas coast, was known to be cannibalistic, but Hugh and his companion made it through the area without being detected. As they went further north, they also crossed into Comanche and Kiowa territory. They successfully evaded them too, but they were eventually captured by the Pawnee in what is now the state of Kansas. The Pawnees weren't known to be cannibals, but they did practice human sacrifice. Most often, this involved a young captive woman as the central figure in a ceremony known as the Morning Star Ritual. Instead of a young woman in this case, the Pawnee decided to use Hugh and his companion, starting with the companion. They then tied the man to a stake and embedded pine slivers into his skin, then lit them on fire. Once these burned like the wick of a candle, his companion was engulfed in flames until there was nothing left. It was clear to Hugh that he was next and there was nowhere to run, so in an effort to appease the chief and hopefully get him to spare Hugh's life, Hugh pulled a bottle of a mineral called cinnabar out of his pocket and offered it to him. Cinnabar was commonly used to make red war paint, makeup, and pottery back then, and afterward the chief took an immediate liking to him. Incredibly, Hugh was then welcomed into the community and lived with the Pawnee for 4 years before leaving. Up to this point, Hugh had always been described as exceedingly brave, bold, and smart, but it was the Pawnee who taught him how to survive and thrive in the wild. When he finally left the tribe in 1822, he came across an ad calling for 100 men to join General William Henry Ashley on a fur trading expedition up the Missouri River. It wouldn't be until the following year when Hugh joined what was known as Ashley's 100, and he set off with them in search of beaver pelts more than 1,500 miles up the Missouri River. For months afterward, the men paddled their boats upstream and were constantly cautious of potential encounters with hostile Native American tribes. Then, in what is today South Dakota, Ashley's 100 entered territory belonging to the Arikara, which is a tribe that played a role in the story of Lewis and Clark on their expedition to the west. Lewis and Clark famously encountered the Arikara in 1804 and convinced them to send a delegation to Washington, D.C., which they did the following year. Unfortunately, while in Washington, the Arikara chief died and the tribe blamed the settlers. From then on, the Arikara were a violent threat to settlers coming through their territory. At least that was something that had been observed on several occasions. In addition, this tribe, like many tribes, settled near rivers and streams, so when Ashley's 100 came paddling up the river, they eventually floated into a village. However, unexpectedly, the tribe was welcoming of the expedition and the two sides arranged several trades. Once the trading was complete though, the Arikara turned on Ashley's 100 and attacked, killing 12 and wounding another dozen, including Hugh. The group did escape, however, and 3 months after escaping and continuing up the Missouri River, the survivors were on dry land, walking 300 miles to a fur trading fort. Still very much in Arikara territory though, the party had to be careful and quiet to keep from being found. At the same time, survival required them to shoot a deer or buffalo every day or two, and the gunshots could be heard for miles around. So inevitably, in June of 1823, the party was attacked again by the Arikara, reducing their numbers even more. The two-time survivors then finally made their way to Fort Kiowa to regroup and rest. While staying there, the party was joined by a man named Andrew Henry, who was Ashley's expedition partner, and he was put in charge of a small group that was sent west to the Yellowstone River. Hugh was among this group, and when they reached the forks of the Grand River in what is now South Dakota, the men split up to scout for game. Then, while slowly treading through the forest, Hugh came around a tree and startled a grizzly bear and her 2 cubs. Hugh's rifle wasn't nearly enough to take down a charging bear, but he didn't have enough time to get a shot off anyway. When the mother bear reached him, she swiped at Hugh's throat and latched her jaws onto the back of his neck before picking him up and swinging him around. Now, what happened next is up for debate, and I also want to give a warning. It's as brief and non-descriptive as possible, but Hugh's injuries were still extensive. In one version of the story, the bear continued to maul Hugh before he managed to kill the bear himself. In another, Hugh screamed for help and the others showed up and killed the bear. Whatever the truth is, Hugh was definitely attacked by a bear and was no doubt in extremely bad shape, as his injuries were well documented in journals by others in the party. The bear attack had resulted in a cut on his throat that was apparently so bad that his breath could be seen escaping through it when he exhaled. He also had large wounds around his body, including his scalp, and another wound on his back was so deep that his ribcage was visible. Even more horrifyingly, where they were was so remote that the nearest settlement was the fort they had rested at, hundreds of miles away. Even if there was anything closer, it was fairly clear to the other members of the group that Hugh wasn't going to survive long. He was conscious, but his breath was labored and he couldn't speak at all. To the surprise of the others, however, Hugh managed to make it through the first night and then the few days that followed, but they were still convinced it was only a matter of time before he succumbed to his injuries. With him surviving longer than they expected and them still needing to continue their journey, Andrew called for some of the men to fashion a makeshift stretcher so they could carry Hugh until he passed away. This drastically slowed them down, and after a few days of hauling around the difficult terrain, Andrew asked 2 of the men to stay behind with Hugh until he died while the others went ahead. Because there was extra money in it for those who volunteered, a man named John stepped forward, and right behind him was another man named Jim, who was just 19 years old. He elected to stay as a show of respect toward Hugh, and he wanted to make sure he had a fitting burial when he died. With that, the others resumed their journey while the 2 volunteers started digging Hugh's grave. In the days that followed, John and Jim managed to give Hugh some water past the hole in his throat, but he spent most of the first few days drifting in and out of consciousness. Then he developed a severe fever and the end looked imminent. One version of the story says that the fever was an indication to John that their work was done, so John and Jim gathered up Hugh's rifle, knife, flint, gunpowder, and other supplies he would no longer need before hurrying in the direction the rest of the group had gone days earlier. In another account, John and Jim were attacked by Arikara warriors and had to run off, taking Hugh's rifle with them. Although the first version is seen as much more likely according to scholars. Either way, even in his hazy state, Hugh heard every word the 2 men said as they took his belongings, and he was aware that they were essentially leaving him for dead. Whether this drove him to survive or not, Hugh's fever broke after a few more days and he became much more lucid. Next, it's unclear why it was special, but the rifle the men took was sentimental to Hugh in some way, and in his mind, he was set on getting it back. When he could, he finally looked down and took stock of his injuries and had to have been horrified to see that he was essentially rotting. His wounds were both infected and filled with maggots. Now, as disturbing as that is, this can actually be preferable in some circumstances, as they will eat the infected tissue and promote healing. So rather than clean the wound, he left it as it was. After that, next to where he was left was a buffalo berry bush that he managed to pick some of the berries from. He then ground the tiny berries into a paste and mixed it with spring water before gulping it down. Then a few days later, he noticed a rattlesnake coming toward him, and when it was close enough, Hugh hit it with a rock several times. Then, after removing the venomous head, because he was still unable to move much and without the necessary supplies to build a fire, Hugh consumed the snake raw. It's unknown how long he was immobile and recuperating the forest for, but as his condition kept improving, he knew he needed a plan. Standing was impossible with a broken leg, but he had to get back to Fort Kiowa somehow, even if he had to crawl the whole way back. The problem was that Fort Kiowa was at least 200 miles or 320 kilometers away. There are mixed accounts of how Hugh reached civilization, but in one, he set his own broken leg and crawled most of the way to the fort before finally making it to his feet. From there, he supposedly limped and stumbled the rest of the way, making it to Fort Kiowa in about 6 weeks. In another version, he dragged himself through the forest doing anything he possibly could to survive, including chasing a pack of wolves off a buffalo carcass so he could eat and dry the strips of meat on the journey ahead. At one point in this version, he was found by members of the Sioux tribe, who then took care of Hugh and transported him to Fort Kiowa. After spending some time at the fort and when he was healed and rested, Hugh got himself some clothes and a rifle with plans of returning to the wilderness to catch up with the Ashley party. After being deserted and what he felt was essentially being robbed by John and Jim, Hugh planned to hunt them down and make them regret their decision. When he was ready to set off, Hugh met some French-Canadian fur traders at the fort who were heading up to the Yellowstone River too. This is where he expected to find John and Jim, so he joined up with the fur traders. They then paddled upstream for 6 weeks without issue until they were attacked by the Arikara once again. Hugh and the traders were on dry land and scattered around the riverbank when the attack began, and the group was apparently caught so off guard that only one of the traders escaped alive. Of course, so did Hugh, and it's believed to be because he was hunting away from the riverbank at the time of the attack. Afterward, once again, he was all alone in the remote wilderness, but he was at least prepared this time. In fact, there wasn't a single thought of turning back, and Hugh pressed on even as winter set in. On New Year's Eve, Hugh came to the fork where the Bighorn River meets the Yellowstone River, and sure enough, that's where he found Ashley's party. As he walked out of the woods, those who were still left in the party couldn't believe their eyes. It was like seeing a ghost. They were told by John and Jim that Hugh was dead, and now there he was, heading right for them. When he reached them though, it was clear he wasn't in the mood for pleasantries. He wanted John and Jim, and he wanted them right away. As it turned out, John left the party not long after leaving Hugh and enlisted in the army. Jim, however, was still with the Ashley party, and Hugh spotted him. Hugh then made a beeline for Jim, fully intending to end Jim's life, but when Jim was cornered, Hugh slowly lowered his rifle. In that moment, Hugh realized that Jim was still an impressionable teenager, and John likely influenced him the day they took his belongings and abandoned him. In addition, Jim was extremely apologetic to Hugh as he braced for a bullet, so instead, Hugh screamed at Jim, but ultimately spared his life. After that was done, the next order of business was the rifle, but Jim explained that he didn't have it. John had taken it with him when he joined the army. After their confrontation, Hugh rejoined as a member of the Ashley expedition, and just shy of March the following year, Andrew sent Hugh and 4 other men to deliver mail to Fort Atkinson in what is now Nebraska. Once the mail was dropped off at a fort, Hugh was ordered to continue on to St. Louis and notify the expedition's financiers of the party's new location at the Bighorn and Yellowstone Fork. When the trek got underway, Hugh started hunting buffalo bulls, which could be used to make what are called bull boats to travel by water. Traveling the river would be faster than walking, so using the large bones of a buffalo to build the frame, Hugh stretched the animal's hide over the bones to create a small, watertight vessel. When the boats were completed, they launched into the northern Platte River, and as expected, they were covering much more distance in less time. The trip continued on until they came upon an Arikara village, almost inevitably at this point. One story says they were under attack almost immediately, and another says the tribe's chief welcomed them into the village, which was a tactic Hugh had witnessed before. It's unclear how they became acquaintances, but in this version, the chief knew of Hugh and invited him for a smoke. But then, while with the chief, Hugh noticed that the other tribe members were stealing supplies from their boat. When Hugh jumped back to his feet, the Arikara began their attack, and 2 of the 5 men in the party were killed. Hugh and the 2 others got away by jumping into the river, but in the frantic escape, he dropped the rifle he had gotten from Fort Kiowa. So alone and without a weapon once again, Hugh pressed on another 400 miles to Fort Atkinson. As with the many times before, Hugh apparently made this long distance on foot, and when he arrived, he learned that Fort Atkinson just so happened to be where John was stationed in the army. As with much of the rest of the story, there are 2 versions of what happened next, but both of them resulted in John remaining alive. In the first, there was a significant hurdle between Hugh and the revenge he so desperately wanted. Killing a United States Army soldier at a United States Army fort had one outcome, and that was Hugh's execution. So instead, before he left the fort for St. Louis, Hugh told John that when he finally left the army, Hugh would be waiting to kill him. In another account, Hugh simply forgives John just like he had Jim, and there was no parting threat. In both versions, an army captain retrieves Hugh's rifle from John's bunk and returns it to its rightful owner. This is where the legend of Hugh Glass comes to an end, and the next we hear of him is in 1833. While on a fur trading expedition, Hugh's luck finally ran out when the Arikara attacked, and he and 2 partners were killed and scalped. It's believed he would have been around 50 years old at the time and that he was buried in an unmarked grave around Bighorn, Montana. So, to reiterate, we know that Hugh Glass existed and that he was attacked by a bear, but beyond that, much of the rest of the story is not so certain. On one hand, a person could have been as tough and as lucky as he was, surviving against all odds and escaping certain death so many times. But it's also likely that many parts of his story have been embellished, changed, or simply forgotten in the 2 centuries since they occurred. In any case, thanks so much for watching. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the form found in the description, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.